I thought it was just one night, just a bit of harmless fun. My wife Sarah and I had been married for 10 years, and like many couples, we'd settled into the routines, sometimes predictable and sometimes comforting. So, when a mutual friend invited us to one of those infamous parties, the kind where couples get a little adventurous, I figured it'd be a way to spice things up, maybe even reconnect. After a couple of drinks, we ended up pairing off with other people for the night. We didn't discuss boundaries much. We both just assumed the night would be nothing more than a one time thing. I didn't realize it at the time, but there were cracks forming in that assumption, in that trust. Sarah seemed a bit more comfortable with the idea than I was. I brushed it off as nerves. She'd always been more social, more open to new things than me. The next day, we didn't talk much about what had happened. She seemed distant, a little too engrossed in her phone. But I chalked it up to the awkwardness of what we just experienced together. I thought that maybe she was just processing it the way I was trying to. I didn't realize there were deeper things going on. A few weeks later, I came home to a strange sight. The house was silent, empty in a way that felt unnatural. As I walked into our living room, I noticed a shredded piece of paper on the floor. My heart sank as I recognized it was our marriage certificate, torn to shreds. Next to it, lying in the middle of the carpet like a dark omen, was Sarah's wedding ring, crushed and flattened. It was as if someone had stomped on it, ground it into the floor. My heart pounded as I tried to understand what was going on. Then, on our bed, I found her letter. She confessed in those pages that she'd felt something different that night at the party. For her, it hadn't been a one-off experiment. She wrote about how the experience had awoken something she'd felt was missing. The man she'd been with, someone she'd only met that night, had reignited a spark she claimed hadn't been there for a long time between us. It hit me then. What had been a one-night thing for me had become an opening for her, a chance to find something beyond what we had. I sat on our bed, the letter crumpling in my hand, feeling like I'd just been sucker punched. I had been so naive, so trusting. I'd thought we'd come out of this experience with a laugh, maybe a new story to tell. I'd never imagined that it would destroy us. I picked up her ring, feeling its weight, imagining all the years, the moments, the promises bound up in it. And just like that, in one night, one choice, it had all unraveled. That night was a blur. I sat on the bed for hours, just staring at her letter, trying to make sense of every word. In the years we'd been married, I never thought I'd be sitting here, reading a goodbye note from her. I tried to recall every moment in the past few months that could have hinted at this. Every quiet dinner, every awkward silence. But I was coming up empty. Around midnight, I finally heard the familiar hum of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. My heart twisted with a strange mix of anger and relief. Part of me didn't even want to see her, but I knew I had to. I couldn't let her walk away without an explanation. When she stepped through the door, her face paled the moment she saw me holding her letter. She didn't say anything at first, just froze there, as if she'd hoped to slip in without a confrontation. Her eyes darted to the ring I'd placed back on the table, flattened and cold. "Were you going to just leave without talking to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, trying to keep my emotions in check. She didn't meet my eyes, just kept looking at the floor. I, I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe a letter would be easier. Easier? I let out a bitter laugh. You think writing it all down in some cold note and leaving it for me to find is easier? Sarah, we've been married for 10 years. I deserved more than that. She finally looked up at me, her face a mixture of guilt and confusion. I didn't want to hurt you, okay? I didn't plan on any of this. That night, it wasn't supposed to mean anything, but I felt, I don't know, alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my own feelings from spiraling out of control. So what then? You just throw everything away? 10 years, our plans, our future, because of some spark with a stranger? Her shoulders slumped, and I saw the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. I don't know who I am anymore, all right? I feel like I've been living someone else's life. I kept thinking, maybe this marriage, this life we've built, was everything I wanted. But that night, it showed me I don't even know what I want. I tried to understand, but the hurt was too raw. So your answer was just to run? She sat down on the armchair across from me, finally looking at me with tears in her eyes. I thought leaving would spare you. I didn't want to drag you through my mess, through all this confusion. We sat there in silence, both of us wrestling with our own feelings. After a while, I asked, "What happens now?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I need time to figure things out, to understand what's going on inside of me." Her words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth of them. In a way, we'd both been drifting, taking each other for granted, assuming that everything would just work out because it always had. Now it was all laid bare, and we were left with nothing but hard choices. Finally, I nodded. "Take your time, Sarah, but I won't wait forever." The days after that night were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. Every corner of our house felt like a reminder of her, of what we used to be, and of how much I'd overlooked, ignored, or assumed was fine between us. It was painful in ways I didn't expect. Mornings were the worst. I'd wake up and feel her absence beside me like a physical ache. That empty space in bed driving it home that she wasn't coming back anytime soon. I tried to keep myself busy, threw myself into work, hit the gym harder than I ever had. Anything to keep my mind off of the conversations we'd had, the way she'd looked at me like she was already half gone. I figured if I stayed busy, I wouldn't have to face the reality that my marriage was unraveling by the day. About 2 weeks later, on a Friday night, I came home to find the porch light on and a note stuck to the front door. It was from Sarah. She'd written just a few lines, something about wanting to talk, to clear things up. She left her phone number at the bottom, though I had it memorized by heart. I stared at that note, my mind racing between relief and dread, wondering if I could even handle hearing more. But I needed answers, or at least closure. So I called. We met up the next evening at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place we'd never been before. It was empty, and I could tell she chose it, so we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. She looked different, somehow both familiar and like a stranger, like the woman I'd married and yet someone I barely recognized. There was an awkward tension between us as we sat down. For a long minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "Thank you for meeting me." I nodded, keeping my hands wrapped around my coffee cup to keep them steady. "I had to, Sarah. I need to understand what happened. What's happening?" She looked down at her own coffee, swirling it with her spoon. "I know I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I never meant for things to go this far." Her words hung in the air, and I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Why, Sarah? Why did you feel like you had to look outside our marriage for whatever it was you were looking for?" She exhaled, eyes tearing up. "I don't know exactly. Maybe I just felt trapped. I kept thinking, is this it? Is this what my life's going to look like for the next 40 years? And then that night, I felt like I had a way to escape, just for a little while. But once I got a taste of something different, I felt my heart sink, hearing her talk about our life like it was some cage she'd been desperate to get out of. So everything we've built, all these years we've been together, that was just you feeling trapped?" She shook her head, tears spilling over. "Number. It wasn't that simple. I loved you. I still do in some way. But I don't think I ever fully knew who I was outside of us. And I don't think I realized that until now. I wanted to yell, to tell her how selfish she was being, that I'd given her everything I had, every bit of my love, my time, my commitment. But somehow, I kept my voice steady. So where does that leave us?" She wiped her tears, staring out the window as though searching for an answer in the dark. "I don't know. I don't know what I want, and I don't want to keep you hanging on while I figure it out." Her words hit me like a blow. She was leaving me, not for anyone else, but just for her, just to see what life felt like without me in it. The finality of it started to sink in, and a hollow sadness filled me. After a long silence, I finally spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Sarah. But just know, you're leaving behind someone who would have fought for this." Her face crumpled, but she didn't say anything. And in that silence, I knew it was over. She didn't have an answer that would fix any of this. We had come to the end of the road, and there was nothing left to do but walk away. So I did. I left her sitting there, holding her coffee cup with that blank look on her face, and I walked out into the night alone. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. I didn't even turn on the radio, just let the silence fill up every corner of my mind. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house felt like a shell, empty, like it was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I went inside and stared at the photos on the wall, those snapshots of moments that seemed so happy, so certain. It felt strange looking at them now, like I was seeing someone else's life. The days that followed were hollow. I moved through routines like a ghost, trying to make sense of what my life looked like without Sarah in it. Friends called, some stopped by, but I kept the details to myself, too proud or maybe too ashamed to admit what had really happened. To everyone else, we'd been the perfect couple. They had no idea we were falling apart, that she was gone, or why. It was about a month later when I found something that would turn everything upside down again. I was cleaning out some of her things that she hadn't come back for. I'd boxed up most of her clothes and packed away the things I thought she'd eventually want. But while emptying her side of the dresser, I found her old phone. She must have forgotten it was there when she upgraded a few months back. Curiosity got the better of me, so I charged it up and turned it on. Part of me knew I shouldn't look, that I should just leave it be. But another part of me, the part still reeling from her leaving, needed to know if there was more to the story. If maybe, somehow, she'd lied to me, even in that final conversation. As I went through her messages, my heart sank. There were old texts from numbers I didn't recognize, messages that started innocently enough, but quickly turned into things I didn't want to see. One thread stood out, messages with a man she'd met at that party, going back months. I scrolled through, piecing together conversations that showed she hadn't just fallen out of love or needed to find herself. She'd been with him, meeting him on the side, even after the party was long over. I felt a surge of anger, the kind that starts deep in your gut and twists until you feel sick. She had been lying the whole time. That talk we had, her tears, her confusion, it was all an act. She'd made a choice, long before she left, and she'd let me sit there, questioning everything about our life together, thinking that maybe I had driven her away. I called her that night. She didn't answer. But she texted me back a while later, a casual, "What's up?" like everything was normal. I couldn't believe her indifference. It was like she'd moved on completely, no longer even considering the wreckage she'd left behind. I replied, keeping it short. "I found your old phone, Sarah." There was a pause, too long of a pause, and then her response came through. So? So, I know everything, I typed back, feeling the weight of those words. I waited, watching the screen, watching as the little dots appeared and disappeared, as if she couldn't figure out how to respond. Eventually, she called me. I picked up, and she was silent on the other end for a long moment before she spoke. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Is there a good way to find out?" My voice was low, barely holding back the resentment, the betrayal. All that talk about finding yourself, needing time, you were just with him, the whole time. She didn't deny it. She just sighed. "I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. That's why I left. I knew that if I told you, it would destroy you." I shook my head, feeling a bitterness rise up in me. "You didn't want to hurt me? Sarah, you did hurt me. And then you left me here to pick up the pieces of something you'd already shattered." I could hear her crying softly on the other end, but it felt hollow now. Whatever pity I'd felt, whatever part of me that had wanted to understand her reasons, it was gone. "You made your choice," I said, my voice steady, final. "I don't know who you are anymore, but the woman I married wouldn't have done this. So go, Sarah, just go." I hung up and sat there feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness. It was over. The marriage, the confusion, the lies. It was all over. There was nothing left for her to explain and nothing left for me to give. All I had now was a chance to start over, to rebuild a life without her. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. In the weeks that followed, I started reaching out to people I'd drifted from. Old friends, family, even some neighbors who'd tried to invite me to their backyard barbecues over the years. But I'd always been too busy. One of those people was my buddy, Luke. We'd been close back in college, thick as thieves, but after Sarah and I got married, we just drifted. He was always around for me, but I'd let the friendship fade as I got wrapped up in life. When he found out what had happened, Luke insisted on dragging me out. Bro, you need to get out of the house, even if it's just for one night, he said over the phone, his voice carrying a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. My cousin is throwing this big cookout. You remember Kyle, right? Kyle, Luke's cousin, had always been the life of any party. If there was one person who could break through this haze, it'd be him. I reluctantly agreed, figuring it couldn't hurt. When I got to the cookout, it was in full swing. People were laughing, music was blaring, and the smell of grilled meat and firewood hung in the air. Luke spotted me immediately and jogged over, clapping me on the back like no time had passed. Glad you made it, man, he said with a grin, handing me a beer. Let's get you reintroduced to the world. He led me around, introducing me to a few familiar faces and a lot of new ones. It felt strange, a little jarring to be around people who were happy, who had no idea of the mess my life had become. But it was good to be among people again, even if part of me felt like a ghost. Eventually, Luke introduced me to a couple of his friends. This is Jenna, he said, motioning to a woman with short, dark hair and an easy smile. And this here's her roommate, Cassie. Cassie looked up at me, offering a shy smile. She was different from the crowd, quieter, her eyes carrying something I couldn't quite place. So, you're the infamous Will, she said, her voice soft but steady. Luke mentioned you'd been through, well, a lot. I nodded, trying to keep it light. That's one way to put it. She didn't press me on it, just nodded with understanding. Well, if you need someone to hide out with, Jenna and I are your people. We're pretty good at hiding from Kyle's crazy party games. Her joke made me laugh, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in a while. As the evening wore on, I found myself gravitating toward Cassie. We talked about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, her job as a paralegal, and my recent attempts to get back into hobbies I'd abandoned long ago. There was something comforting about her presence, a calm I hadn't felt since Sarah left. At some point, I ended up telling her more than I meant to about what had happened, about Sarah's betrayal, how I'd been left to pick up the pieces alone. She listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with sympathy, but never with pity. When I was done, she shook her head. I don't understand how people can do that to each other, she said softly, to walk away without a second thought, without considering the impact. It's been hard, I admitted, feeling raw, exposed, but I guess it's taught me a lot about people, and about myself. We stood in silence for a moment, letting the sounds of laughter and music wash over us. Then, with a small, hesitant smile, she nudged my arm. Hey, if you're looking for a distraction, Jenna and I were going to check out this art exhibit downtown tomorrow. You should come. It was a casual invitation, nothing pressured, but there was something in her eyes, an openness, that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I could start to find a way forward. All right, I said, surprised at myself for agreeing so quickly. I could use a distraction. The next day, I found myself at the gallery with Cassie and Jenna. The exhibit was all about light and shadow, a mixture of abstract paintings and sculptures that played with reflections and shapes in ways I hadn't seen before. As we walked through the space, I found myself relaxing, drawn into the artwork in a way that reminded me of what life was supposed to feel like: calm, curious, alive. At one point, we stopped in front of a large, twisted metal sculpture, one that seemed to mirror my own tangled mess of thoughts and feelings. Cassie stood next to me, studying it with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said quietly, sometimes you have to let go of what's broken to find what's beautiful. Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. She looked over, giving me a small, encouraging smile, and something inside me started to loosen, like maybe there was still hope for me somewhere out there. By the time we left the gallery, Jenna had to run to a work meeting, leaving Cassie and me to grab coffee on our own. We sat in a cozy little cafe nearby, and I found myself sharing even more with her. She told me about her own past relationships, how she'd been hurt before, but learned to move forward, to believe in something better. You know, she said as she stirred her coffee, it sounds like you're finally starting to live for yourself again. That's a big deal, Will. You're allowed to put yourself first. Her words lingered with me as we left the cafe and went our separate ways. And over the next few weeks, I found myself feeling lighter, more in control. Cassie and I stayed in touch, meeting up for coffee, going to small events around town, little things that reminded me of who I was outside of my marriage. It was a slow process, but with each day, each laugh, each conversation, I felt a bit of myself returning. Cassie became a constant, a friend who understood without judgment, who encouraged me to start fresh. And then, just when I thought I was finally moving on, a text popped up on my phone from Sarah. Hey, can we meet? I know I hurt you, but I'd like to talk. I stared at the message, my mind spinning. Part of me felt the old ache, the part that had wanted answers, that had clung to our memories. But then I thought of Cassie, of Luke, of the people who'd stepped up when I was at my lowest. And I realized something. I didn't need Sarah's answers anymore. I didn't need her apology, her explanations, her attempts to ease her own guilt. But maybe for the first time I could face her without feeling that crushing weight. When I got Sarah's message, I knew I had two choices: ignore it and keep moving forward, or meet with her and finally close the chapter on my terms. I wrestled with the decision all night, memories of us together clashing with the reality of what she'd done. The next morning, I texted her back a simple, okay, let's meet. We agreed on a little diner just outside town, a neutral place far from the memories of our old life together. When I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She was sitting in a booth by the window, looking almost the same as the day she left, poised, polished, but there was a weariness in her face, as though the weight of her choices had finally started to catch up to her. She looked up as I approached, offering a small, tentative smile. Hey, Will, she said, her voice soft, almost shy. I nodded, sliding into the seat across from her. Sarah. An awkward silence settled between us as we looked at each other. The waitress came by, took our coffee orders, and left us alone. Sarah fidgeted with her hands, finally breaking the silence. Thank you for meeting me. I know I don't deserve it, she started, her voice thick with regret. I'm here, I replied, keeping my tone even. I didn't want to make this easy for her. I wasn't here to comfort her or to make her feel better about what she'd done. I was here to get my own closure, to finally put her behind me. She looked down, swallowing hard. I don't even know where to start. I've thought about this moment 1,000 times. But now that I'm here, her voice trailed off and she looked up, her eyes brimming with guilt. I know I hurt you more than I can ever make right. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, Will. I thought I wanted something else, something different. But I was wrong. I felt a strange, detached calm wash over me. Why now, Sarah? What made you suddenly realize this? She glanced out the window, struggling with her answer. I guess it took losing you to understand what I had. I thought I was unhappy, that our life was too predictable. But it wasn't that. I was the problem, not us. I took a long sip of my coffee, letting her words sink in. The strange thing was, I didn't feel that familiar anger rising up. Instead, I felt an unexpected clarity, as if I could finally see things for what they were. So, what are you hoping for now? I asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated, looking at me with that pleading look I used to know so well. I don't expect you to take me back. I know that's probably out of the question. But I needed you to know that I made a mistake, that I regret everything. For a long moment, I just looked at her. I thought about everything we'd shared, the life we'd built together, and all the moments that led us to this broken final meeting. But as I sat there, I realized something. I had already moved on. I didn't need her apology to heal. I had already started down a new path, one that didn't include her. Sarah, I said finally, keeping my voice calm and steady, I appreciate you saying that. But I've found my own closure, and I don't need anything more from you. I wish you well, I really do. But I've moved on. Her face fell, and I saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. Maybe she'd hoped for forgiveness, for some kind of absolution, but that wasn't mine to give. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I loved you. I still do. I took a deep breath, absorbing her words without letting them penetrate. Goodbye, Sarah. I stood up and left her sitting there, holding on to a past I had finally released. As I stepped outside into the cool autumn air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. That night, I texted Cassie, asking if she wanted to grab a late dinner. She was quick to respond, sending back a playful, "Thought you'd never ask." We met up at a small, cozy restaurant downtown, and as we settled into a booth, I felt a warmth that had been absent from my life for so long. She looked at me with that curious, attentive gaze and asked, "So, how did it go?" I took a sip of my drink, chuckling softly. It went fine. Better than I expected, actually. I think I've finally closed that door. Cassie smiled, a genuine look of happiness lighting up her face. I'm glad, Will. You deserve some peace. The evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation. Cassie had this way of making me feel understood, without ever pushing me to explain. She just got it. She got me. And for the first time, I felt hopeful. Like maybe life wasn't about trying to fix the past, but embracing the future. As we walked out of the restaurant and stood under the city lights, I turned to her, the words spilling out before I could second-guess myself. You know, I never thought I'd feel this way again. But with you, it's different. Cassie smiled, a warmth spreading across her face as she looked at me. Maybe it's time for a fresh start, Will. And as I looked at her, I realized that's exactly what I was ready for. Over the next few months, my life took on a new rhythm, one that felt grounded, hopeful, and even exciting. Cassie and I continued to see each other, slowly getting to know each other in that real, raw way that doesn't happen overnight. She was patient, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't done with anyone in years, not even Sarah. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people who had come through their own struggles, taking things day by day. We spent weekends exploring the city, going on impromptu road trips, hiking, hitting little cafes and art galleries. Cassie introduced me to her circle of friends, a small but tight-knit group, each of them as quirky and real as she was. Her roommate, Jenna, quickly became a good friend to me, too. Jenna was loud and funny, and it was easy to see why she and Cassie were close. She had this protective, sisterly vibe, always giving me the look when Cassie wasn't watching, like she'd take me down if I hurt her friend. One Saturday afternoon, Cassie and I were on a hike in the hills just outside of town. It was autumn, the air crisp and fresh, leaves crunching beneath our boots as we made our way along the trail. The path wound upward, giving us a view of the town below, the distant roofs and streets looking tiny and peaceful from up high. Cassie took a deep breath, smiling as she looked over at me. You know, I haven't done this since I was a kid, she said, tilting her face to the sun. My parents used to bring me and my brothers out here. We'd pack sandwiches and spend the whole day exploring. I watched her, realizing how easy it had become to talk about the future with her, without hesitation. You should show me all the best spots. I could use a few new places to explore, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Cassie looked back at me, her gaze serious for a moment. Are you sure, Will? I mean, about us? I stopped, feeling the weight of her question in the moment. Yes, I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. I was broken, Cassie, but you helped me put myself back together. With you, I don't feel like I'm just surviving. I'm living. She reached for my hand, and we stood there for a moment in the quiet, just looking at each other, like the world had fallen away, and it was just the two of us on that hillside. We didn't need to say anything else. Everything was in the way she held my hand, the way she leaned into me, grounding me in that moment. As time went on, I started reconnecting with other people from my old life, friends I'd lost touch with, family I hadn't been close to in years. Luke and I started meeting up regularly, catching up like no time had passed. And my parents, who had always been supportive but never pushy, noticed the shift in me and welcomed Cassie with open arms. They could see the change in me, that I was finally coming back to life, and it made them happier than I'd seen them in years. One evening, Cassie and I invited Jenna and Luke over for dinner. The four of us sat around my kitchen table, laughter filling the room as Jenna teased Luke about his terrible dating history, and Luke retaliated with embarrassing stories from their college days. Cassie watched with a smile, looking more at home than ever. Midway through dinner, Jenna leaned over and nudged me with a grin. "So, Will, any big plans for the future?" She waggled her eyebrows playfully. Her question loaded with that knowing look she always gave me when Cassie wasn't looking. Cassie rolled her eyes, but I couldn't help but smile. The truth was, I'd been thinking a lot about the future, more than I'd let on. It was a different feeling than before, a quiet certainty that I hadn't felt in years. I took Cassie's hand under the table, feeling the warmth of her fingers lacing through mine. "Actually, yeah," I said, glancing over at Cassie with a smile, "but one step at a time." She squeezed my hand, her smile as soft and hopeful as I felt inside. A few months later, Luke, Jenna, Cassie, and I took a weekend trip to the mountains. We'd rented a small cabin, cozy and a little rustic, surrounded by pine trees and with a view that stretched on for miles. We spent our days hiking, exploring nearby trails, and in the evenings we'd sit around the fire pit, talking and laughing beneath the stars. One night, after everyone else had gone inside, Cassie and I sat together by the dying fire, wrapped in a shared blanket as the embers glowed softly in the darkness. "This has been a good year," I said, my voice low, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "A hard one, but good." Cassie nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. "Sometimes the best things come from the hardest places," she said, her words soft. "You've come so far, Will. I'm so proud of you." Her words hit me deep, and I looked down at her, feeling that same certainty I'd felt on the hillside months ago. "Cassie, there's something I want to ask you." She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and maybe a hint of excitement. I took a deep breath, reaching into my jacket pocket, where I'd kept a small, simple ring I'd been holding onto for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want it with you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Cassie's eyes filled with tears, a smile breaking across her face as she nodded, barely able to get the words out. "Yes, yes, Will, of course." We held each other in the quiet of that night, surrounded by the forest and the stars, the warmth of the fire fading, but the warmth between us burning bright. I had come through the worst, and on the other side, I'd found something beautiful, something worth holding on to, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt at peace. After our engagement, everything seemed to fall into place. Cassie and I shared our news with our friends and family, and while everyone was thrilled, a small part of me still felt unsettled, as if there was a loose end I hadn't quite tied up. It was like a shadow following me around, a quiet voice that wouldn't let me forget the damage Sarah had caused. Despite my happiness, I hadn't truly closed that chapter. The chance to do that came unexpectedly. One night I was out with Luke when we ran into Sarah's old friend Ellen at a bar downtown. Ellen knew everything that had happened with Sarah, and after a few drinks, she let slip that Sarah had been going through a rough time herself. Her new life hadn't turned out as she expected. The man she'd left me for had ghosted her not long after we'd finalized the divorce. And now she was struggling with work, with money. She'd even tried dating, but had trust issues, apparently. I felt a sick satisfaction hearing that. I'd moved on, built something good from the ruins she'd left behind, while her life was crumbling. It felt like karma, though I knew it wasn't enough to fully settle things. Then Luke looked over at me, his eyes gleaming with an idea. "You know, Will," he said, "maybe it's time you gave her a taste of her own medicine. Let her feel the regret for real. You know she's still living in that fancy downtown apartment she thought would be her freedom from you. Imagine what it'd be like for her to see you now, with Cassie by your side, to see you happy." His words hung in the air, tempting me. I'd been focusing on moving forward, but something about facing Sarah with my new life felt right. I wanted her to see that she hadn't destroyed me. I wanted her to know she was the one who had lost. A few weeks later, I went through with it. Luke, Cassie, and I were out at a local art festival, one of the annual events that Sarah and I had loved going to. It felt strange being there without her, but it was empowering too. Cassie and I walked hand in hand, stopping by different stalls, laughing and enjoying the day. as if fate had orchestrated it. We ran into Sarah in the crowd. She spotted me first, and I watched her face shift from surprise to something else, something dark and painful. She looked at Cassie, her eyes taking in the way we were together, how happy and at ease we seemed. "Will," she said, her voice tinged with something I hadn't heard before. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was jealousy. I didn't care. "Sarah," I replied coolly, my arm wrapping tighter around Cassie. "Good to see you." Sarah's eyes flickered to Cassie, who gave her a polite smile, completely unfazed. Cassie knew the story. She knew everything. She leaned into me, her presence solid and unbothered, while Sarah looked like she was barely keeping it together. "So, this is her?" Sarah asked, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady, my gaze never leaving her face. "Cassie and I are engaged." I watched as the words hit her, as her face paled slightly, her expression tight with the weight of her own choices. She had thrown away everything we'd built together for a fantasy, and now she was standing there, faced with the reality of it. Cassie, sensing the tension, held out her hand to Sarah, who took it reluctantly. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. Will's told me a lot about you," Cassie said, her voice as calm as ever. Sarah just nodded, her eyes darting between us. I, I'm happy for you, Will, really." I didn't answer, just watched her struggle to keep her composure. It was a small, quiet victory, but it was enough. She could see that I'd moved on, that I was building a life without her, a life that was better, more real, and rooted in something honest. As Cassie and I walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. Sarah had finally seen that I'd not only survived her betrayal, but come out stronger for it. She had nothing left to take from me, no power to hold over me. And for the first time, I felt truly free. That night, Cassie and I sat on my porch, the stars overhead, a bottle of wine between us. I told her everything about that run-in, about how it had been the closure I didn't know I needed. She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "You're free now, Will. She can't haunt you anymore." And as I sat there with Cassie, with the future stretching out in front of us, I realized she was right. The ghost of Sarah was finally gone, and all that remained was a new life, a new love, and the peace I'd fought so hard to find. We clinked our glasses, toasting to the future, and as the night stretched on, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.